Dan Lizette with the Podcast Digest. Welcome back to episode 161. Happy you guys decided to return. We've got another news episode for you, going over a bunch of interesting and cool conversational topics, but I can't do that alone. I, of course, need my trusty sidekick, my trusty co-host, Jason, a.k.a. Agent Palmer. Jason, how you doing, man?
I'm doing very well.
Good. You ready to talk some pod news this week?
I am, and it's the perfect time of year for a podcast, right? You put your earbuds in, and you just sit in front of the fireplace, right? Fall has descended upon the Northeast.
Did I say episode 161 or 162? It's 162.
It's 162.
Okay. Did I say the wrong thing?
I think you did. I didn't want to.
I think I did too.
I didn't want to
Folks,
mess up
it's
your
162.
flow.
You already knew that because you read it on the app, and you decided to listen, and for that, we both greatly appreciate you doing that. So
we do.
162, all kinds of pod news going on, and it's been a little bit. We're a couple days late again with a new episode. Again, folks, that's my fault. We are going to get better, and any of the delays, as I said last time, have been my fault. Some of you know that I am also a mobile DJ. Some of you who are familiar with the wedding industry also know that September and October are very, very popular months, and I've been very, very busy and working very, very hard, 6+ days a week, and the Podcast Digest hasn't bubbled up to the top of my to-do list until now. So from here on forward, we should get a lot more regular and should appear in your feed with regularity. But that's what I've been up to lately. Jason, I haven't chatted in a bit. What's been going on in the world of Agent Palmer?
The blog continues. I write and I write and I write. That's the weekly thing. But this week, I got to drop episode 4 of the Palmer Files with Margot, the Brooklyn Fit chick. And we got to talk about like health and wellness, and then we both had fast food jobs at franchises of former actors, right? Because I worked at Arthur Treacher's and she worked at Roy Rogers, and we get to tell a few youthful, exuberant stories there.
We're all connected, Jason. Really,
we are all connected. But what's exciting to me is that because I really want to say this on air. Your Yankees did not make the World Series, which if anybody wants to talk about things that could have gotten in the way of this particular episode of the Podcast Digest, we could have been postponed even further because I got a text from Dan last week that said, this is when we're available, except if my Yankees are playing.
And folks, that's the end of the Podcast Digest. We've had a great run. Thank you for joining us for 162 episodes. Signing off. I hate baseball. I hate all things football right now. Sports are terrible. I'm thinking of reading a lot more books, which, in fact, I did buy a book today. So, bam, I'm getting into books. This is how we know my New York sports teams are doing absolutely terrible. I am actively paying money for books nowadays. So, there we go. This is where we are in the fall of 2019. We're in a lot of other places in the fall of 2019 because there's a lot of other things going on in this wonderful world of podcasting, which still means so much to both Jason and I. Jason has 352 shows he's a host, co-host, or guest on, and I spend 100 hours a week listening. So let's talk about some of those topics going on in the world of podcasting. And our first topic this week comes from Jason.
It is... new in Apple Podcasts, you can search the audio. Now, this is in beta, and apparently, for the moment, it's only available to the podcast that Apple has enabled transcripts for, but this is a glimpse into the future, Dan. Are you how excited are you, I guess would be the question.
I definitely think it's cool, and the biggest thing, of course, is what are we talking about here? We're talking about SEO. Right? We're really talking about Google search and the idea of your podcast episode surfacing to the top of those results. So if you and I had a show and we covered, I don't know, seashell collections, if we talked about that in the episode, then that episode could bubble to the top of seashell collection searches, which is currently something that isn't happening right now in a large degree. But we talked in a previous episode about Google getting better about this, especially making things like show notes more searchable. And Apple Podcasts providing transcripts. Those transcripts can obviously be published, and SEO could be a big deal.
Yeah, I think the most important thing is that there are a plentiful number of episodes that cover multiple topics. And even on this show, where in the show notes you'll see the items that we covered, we may not, there might be a very juicy tangent, right? That's full of information. But, you know, our show notes aren't a transcript of everything. So that, you know, little tangent may not come up in search because we didn't put it in the show notes. Having the search by audio, basically, you know, because it's coming out of the transcript, means that that tidbit we did off topic about dragons, you know, because they're easier to say than seashells, Dan.
I like my seashells. I know Sally pretty well.
But it means that you can still stumble upon this episode where we talked about dragons without it being in the show notes. And I feel like that's huge because as podcasters in general, and I'm going to speak in generalizations for a moment, we get into habits of this is how I segment my show notes, or this is how I title my shows or subtitle my shows. And there's never going to be a scenario, unless you have an actual transcript, where you have everything in the show notes and the title, and it's all completely SEO optimized, unless you're, you know, focused on one, you know, topic. So this kind of opens the door, right? And as transcripts become more ubiquitous to podcasting in general, and they're adopted by the indie podcasters, the search the audio function is going to be I feel like not only a great tool, but it's going to be like the new YouTube, where it's going to be a place where you can get lost.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think that searching the audio is going to allow a lot of things to surface that otherwise wouldn't. And I think there's a lot of uses that we're not even necessarily discussing right now that don't come to front of mind, but I also think are super important. One, I think folks with disabilities, right, especially the deaf audience, right, idea of transcripts for every podcast would be a huge boon for that audience. And I know there's screen readers and audio or visual feedback to a lot of text versions of podcasts and things of that nature, but I think there's even more than that. We are talking so far about the idea of conversational podcasts and the idea of tangents being surfaced, stuff that's not in show notes. But one thing that I think that's worth considering is scripted podcasts. And what I mean by that is this reminds me of something from years ago. That friend of the show, previous guest, Aaron Mankey from Lore, used to publish transcripts effectively of his older podcasts, and he put them in a book that was ultimately available to his Patreons. And when you think about that concept, a scripted show, think about an independent audio drama or an audio comedy or something like that. I remember there were previous guests of the show that I was speaking to, and I probably need to look them up and think about what they're doing nowadays, but they used to do comedy and drama podcasts, and they were an independent group of friends who were self-producing this thing. The idea that their podcast could effectively have transcripts automatically spit out on the back end that could be effectively publishable on a website, searchable, or even better, reproduced in the form of potentially a script or a play or something of that nature could be very, very powerful. I'm thinking of something like, if you look at like Nate DeMeo with the Memory Palace on Radiotopia, I mean, he spends hours and hours and hours for every episode crafting that script that you hear audibly, but this is literary level prose and storytelling. And the idea of that being in, say, a nice paperback book that you could go back to or read, that type of thing, there's a lot of different uses for the idea of searchable audio and transcription of a podcast that I think go well beyond just the idea of, searchable topics in a conversational show.
No, absolutely. And it's exciting to me on a number of levels. And I feel like you kind of hit the nail on the head, which is we still don't know what will happen, like what this will do. And that's exciting. That's what still makes podcasting a little bit more of the wild, wild west that it still is.
That is a very favorite term nowadays, Wild Wild West, in terms of podcasting. It's definitely an interesting development, and we're going there, right? We talked a few episodes back about some of the stuff that Google's doing, and now Apple's getting on board. We're going to live in that world very, very soon, I think. 2020, it could be the time where effectively if you publish a podcast, the text of it's searchable, be it through Google, be it through other means, be it through an automatic generated transcript that's on demand through your podcast player, what have you. It's coming. It'll be here very soon. And yes, there are all kinds of potential ramifications of that being so. And I think it's super exciting, and I share your enthusiasm on that, Palmer. But we got another topic. We got another topic to hop over to, and I'm going to throw this one to you as well, Jason, if you don't mind. You're doing so well explaining these topics to me. Tell me a little bit about some Stitcher research.
Stitcher did some research and released it very recently, in which new podcast listeners are younger, more diverse, and more likely to be female. So the numbers are more than 31% of new podcast listeners are aged between 13 and 24. So 65% are female and 30% are non-white. Nearly half of the 17% of those that have been tuning in for, more than a year. What's the most standout statistic to me in all of this? And I'd love to say it's the female one, but for me, it's the youth one. I feel like the 31% of new listeners are 13 to 24 is a product of 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds being more familiar and getting those smart devices, right? Like Dan and I are from an era where we had Walkman. So we didn't have these smart devices, but the familiarity and the ability to turn to a podcast, this is exciting for me, and it's probably one of the number one reasons everybody talks about podcasting as a growth market.
Yeah, and it is super interesting, and because it is now finally breaking out of the white guy world, and that is super exciting to me. I mean, there's a quote in the article attached to the tweet that would sort of jumpstart this conversation, and this one came from Sarah Van Mosel. She is the Chief Revenue Officer of Stitcher, said that if you look back even just a few years ago, podcasting was basically a white guy in his 30s kind of platform, and that's no longer the case. We're seeing real diversification of the space, and that means it's starting to look like a lot more what mainstream America looks like, and I completely agree. Because, a lot of tech bros, if you were the, it's generally your 30s, 40s white guys. Me. Jason. And we were on the podcast bandwagon pretty early. But be that Apple adding the podcast app as a built-in, the success of Serial, the televising, if you will, of some of the big shows now moving over, and Amazon Prime's doing a lot to help that. So, through any of that, or just the mention of podcasts in general mainstream media, you now are hearing politicians being quoted on things they said on podcasts, regular network TV shows referencing podcasts. You are seeing it all over the place now, and all of this is contributing to bringing in a much larger swath of listeners and basically starting to fill the gaps of what was previously there, us, with everybody else. And I think that's awesome, and I think that's even more exciting when we start to see the show selections start to reflect that. There is still a minority of women-hosted shows, or a minority of minority-hosted shows, and hopefully that is going to start to even out to reflect this new listenership. I think it's coming. I think it's great, and I can't wait to listen to that stuff. It is. Podcasting's growing up, Jason.
Well, and it was within the last few months, I think. Maybe it was within the last year. I don't remember. Marin was on The Simpsons to have Krusty on his podcast in that episode of The Simpsons. And most recently, Saturday Night Live did a podcast spoof. And when you're talking about pop culture, or just cultural touchstones being made fun of or being a part of The Simpsons and Saturday Night Live, these are big time elements. These aren't just, I was mentioned on X, Y, and Z. It was podcasting was spoofed on Saturday Night Live and, made an appearance on The Simpsons. So we're here, right? And as that audience diversifies and as the creator base diversifies, you'll see podcasting reflect more of what it's supposed to reflect, which is all of us. Not all of us white guys, but all of us.
Exactly. And that's the beautiful thing about any creative space, right? Be that YouTube, be that, in the glory days of Tumblr, or just having websites in and of itself, or other creative ventures. Audiences tend to want to gravitate towards creators who they see themselves in, or are talking about interests that are interesting to them, or that they personally feel passionate about in their own lives. And as the creator space starts to serve more and more of those needs of this broader swath of folks that are coming in, it's going to be, one of the things that, just to kind of build upon what I just said, if you look at your now sort of cable TV offering, it sort of is a microcosm of what I'm talking about here, in that there is sort of a channel, at least one, for so many diverse interests, whether into home planning or art or music, or, certain types of movies, or movies from a particular time, or, music videos of a certain genre, or, comedy and a certain, and on and on and on and on, 250, 300 channels on some cable package offering. And that's because they are all trying to serve a particular niche or interest from the general viewership. Podcasts are now starting to sort of take on that similar approach to, let's start to serve all of these different interests and niches. What's so great about the podcast space, and we always kind of go without saying, is that you, person listening to my voice right now, you could be that person that starts that show, that serves that niche, that feeds that interest that you have. And the barrier to entry keeps coming lower and lower and lower. And, you can't start a cable channel, for most of you listening. I know I can't. Maybe Jason can. But most of us can't start a cable channel to serve that niche. But you could probably start a podcast to serve that niche and end up being a voice of authority, or a voice those others look to for their take on that interest. If it's not currently being served, you might be the one to do it.
It goes back to Dan's appearance on my show, where he never created his dog podcast. Somebody did, right? I'm sure if you look, somebody did. Dan wasn't the guy to do it. Somebody else did it. But that doesn't mean everything's taken, right? And in a world where people need to start looking at podcasting like they look at the internet at large. Sure, the internet at large has everything, right? There's a website for almost anything and everything. The same will one day be said of podcasts. We're just not there yet. So if your niche isn't there, you can create it.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's happening every day. I mean, there's numbers out there about how many new shows are launching daily or weekly or monthly. It's a lot. There's a lot of people launching them, and a lot of people are worried about discovery, and a lot of people talk a lot about finding new shows and things of that nature. And, that will continue to be an issue, just like it is for cable TV or it is Netflix. I mean, probably an overwhelming majority of people listening to Netflix right now have or listening to us right now have a Netflix subscription, and there is, I guarantee you, and this isn't an exaggeration, I don't feel, hundreds of shows and movies that are in your subscription that, depending upon how you go through the menus, you don't even know exist. And I can prove this because I did this the other day by accident. I was searching for something, and I typed one letter. I don't know what it was, like a T. And then all of a sudden, a bunch of stuff populated, and it was stuff I didn't even know was there. Why? Because the 8 or 10 or 12 horizontal scrolling panels that they give you for watch it again, new films, most watched, action comedies, survival drama or whatever. It didn't happen to fall into that. And there is so much out there inside Netflix that I promise you don't know exists. Go ahead and search a letter or two in your Netflix search box, and I guarantee you, scroll through that list, you're going to be shocked at what you'll see, because it's just not being thrown in your face. And if it's not thrown in your face, you don't even know it's there. Well, podcasts are very much the same way. Whereas Netflix has an algorithm that's kind of analyzing you and your viewership, it's gotten good or better over the years on delivering, hopefully, front and center things you may or may not be interested in. Hopefully, you'll be interested in. Podcasting still hasn't sort of had that breakthrough yet. There are apps that do things similar and what have you, but there's a lot of stuff in there, and a lot of that could be your niche. So use the search box in your apps. This is how I started in podcasts. I searched the things, the topics, the words I wanted to hear more about. If you start out in a podcasting app doing that, you're going to be able to bring forward some things that aren't just on some recommended screen to you. And that's a great way to kind of start this whole process.
I mean, that's how I'm doing it, or that's how I did it. I mean, I went from one show, and then I think I stated this on an earlier episode, or on an episode of something recently, which was
too many podcasts, Jason.
My initial searching into podcasting was like just geek and nerd. Like, I never drilled down. It wasn't until like much later that I actually drilled down into specific, is there a podcast for this, or even an episode on X? Like, it just took me so long to get there. But I feel like the real entry is listen, broad-based shows are good, and conversation shows that cover general topics are good. But you know what? The one you're going to really love, that's the super niche one. That's the one that, listening to the podcast becomes just like hanging out with your friends, talking about that one movie no one else cares about but you guys. That's the one.
I don't care about that movie. For the record. Speaking of super niche, we've got more news in this front, and this is this is an interesting one, and I don't have a Wall Street Journal subscription, so I don't know the details, but I can read a headline, damn it, and it says, Marvel strikes podcast deal with Sirius XM.
That's correct, Dan. They
what is that?
Well, it's twofold, really. The first one is everybody's like, SiriusXM is not a podcast thing. No, but they own Pandora, and Pandora, as we all know, has podcasts, but their podcast numbers are not so good. So the exclusivity deal, which I don't know how exclusive it's going to be, but at the very least, at the moment, there's going to be some exclusive podcasts for Sirius and other streaming services, including Pandora, and they're going to be Marvel-based. So we'll see what that means. And I say we'll see what that means because, as we talked about in the last news episode, I use Stitcher, and Stitcher has a exclusive X-Men live action audio drama. So for anyone, like, not to get too super deep into the weeds, but I don't know what Marvel striking a deal, like what content comes, right? We just know it's something superhero based, presumably, because that's what's worked at the box office, and they're hoping it comes to Pandora. But Dan, the more important question that this brings to me is, I'm a guy who we talked about Netflix. I have Netflix, and I have Amazon Prime, and I have Hulu. And my girlfriend Steph has DC Universe, and we have Sling TV. I've talked her out of getting the CBS streaming service because I was like, we don't need another one, and I know.
But she's definitely signing up for Disney Plus next month, right?
Well, that's a different conversation. We're going to get Disney Plus, but I want to.
Yes.
Here's the thing: I also have ESPN as a streaming ESPN Plus, so I want the ESPN Hulu Disney Plus bundle, which is
$12.99 a month. That's what I'm signing up for.
But it's not available for pre-order.
Right. Exactly.
So I'm waiting for that one. But it just kind of happened, right? Like most of the people out there listening probably have more than one streaming service for video. But for the most part, podcast listeners have users of podcast apps have gotten accustomed to, I can get everything on my one app. And I'm wondering how exclusive there are some exclusive shows, but most of them are still available in some capacity on Apple, right? I mean, it's just the way it is for the most part. And because exclusive deals end up being in podcasting, at least at the moment, exclusive deals tend to be more like ad-free here, but with an ad over here, right? Is an exclusive deal like? Maybe Marvel's not the one for you, Dan, but like, is there a scenario where people are going to start having multiple podcast apps for the sake of exclusive content like we do video?
Yep. I think so. I think that's where we're going. I don't think we can stop it. And I think the reason I feel that way is exactly what you were sort of alluding to earlier. We talked a little bit about cable and Netflix in this podcast already, but it sort of is instructive in this conversation as well. And that is that the cable model started to break down. And what you saw was each individual provider, be it Time Warner with HBO Max or, a conglomerate with Hulu, ultimately now just Disney themselves, ESPN, and of course you had your Netflix and your Hulu over here as well, Amazon Prime, started to invest and create their own original content that is and forever will be only housed with them. This is why Netflix started with House of Cards and Lilyhammer, that they saw way 6, 7, 8 years ago that if they were going to survive, they had to have things that you could only come to Netflix to find. They got on this bandwagon early. They are pumping out originals at an exorbitant rate. I can't keep up anymore. I don't know that anybody can. I don't think there's a person that's watched all the Netflix originals. And they continue to do that at extraordinary levels. And that's going to continue. And because they want to make their monthly cost an invaluable cost to you, to make it feel as if you can never watch everything that's there, that there's always more to see, and hopefully that it lives up to a particular quality level. Now, translating this whole conversation over to podcasting, I ask sort of rhetorically, what makes anyone think that this entertainment consumption platform that we've already discussed is growing, is continually expanding its base, and more mainstream acceptance and folks listening isn't going to follow a similar model? Now, you can say, well, podcasts have always been free. Of course, I wouldn't do that. Well, I will point to a couple different things. One, broadcast television versus cable, right? Broadcast television was previously free, and then everybody started paying for cable. And then not only did people keep paying for cable, but they decided to pay for more when they got stuff like HBO or Cinemax. And I think that's what's happening is if that you can provide. Look, I was, and folks listening here probably do the same thing. I was looking at Star Wars tickets for December. They just went on sale at the time of this recording. And the IMAX near me is charging $19.65 for Thursday night, the 19th screenings for $19.65. And you know what? It was almost sold out, and the on sale just got announced today. Okay? That means people are still more than willing to pay a lot for entertainment that really sort of inspires them, motivates them, excites them, and enthuses them. Well, if podcasting can do that, and if you're listening to the show right now, you're probably a super passionate podcast listener. Look at your subscription list. Are there a couple of shows that if for some reason tomorrow they said, you've got to give me $0.25 if you want to listen to the next episode, would you throw them 25 cents? I bet you would. I know I would. I could think of probably a half dozen or more shows that I would do that easily and more. So think about that. If you say yes to that, don't you think these creators know that? Don't you think the big companies getting behind the Spotifys and the others coming in, the Stitchers, they know that? That's where we're heading. So I understand we've enjoyed a world of free podcasts up to now, and there will probably always be an element of free podcasts, just like there are free TV shows and broadcasts and stuff like this. But you will start paying for premium stuff, and it's coming.
I guess it's that I don't know, that I was there first mentality, before your band signs the big contract. But you're right. It's a progression. That's where we're going. I made the list of all the streaming services we have in this house. It's a lot. And yeah. I know I've willingly paid for all of them, but 2 years ago I would have been like, nah, I got Netflix and Prime. I'm good. I don't need more than two.
Right.
It's just it just kind of happens, and I feel like it just takes that one. It's that one thing. Whatever it was. I think I already had Prime and Netflix, so that was just a sure. And then you're like, oh, but this one over here, and that's how it happens.
That's all it takes. That's all it takes. And exclusives, and I'll kind of get back to the main sort of subject here, that's how you get drawn in. Here's a controversial statement. I believe you, Jason, and almost every other person, whether it be written word or audio, podcast commentary space, has absolutely trashed Luminary in every way, shape, or form, and justifiably so, as far as I'm concerned. Their launch was terrible. The communication was ridiculous. The stuff they tried to do from Jump Street, ripping out links from show notes and all this stuff, it was a wreck. But I wonder if 10 years from now, we may not look back at something like Luminary, whether it's still around or not, and say, they may have jacked it up from Jump Street, but they were onto it. They knew, and there were things precursor to Luminary there for years now. There's been monetization efforts, whether it be Stitcher Premium or things like Earwolf, doing a lot of monetization for back catalogs. They were doing WTF, last 50 are free. The previous, you would open up Memberful or Patreon, opening up special stuff. It's sort of been a running theme of our relaunch, the Podcast Digest, in the past couple of months. But, Luminary was always billed as sort of the Netflix for podcasts. It's not. But they do have exclusive content. And the fact of the matter is, if you want to hear that, there's only one way you can hear it, and that is pay them $8 a month. Now, you can definitely have a lot to say about how they launched, their general business practices, or their current roster of shows. You can. But again, think about your 3 favorite shows. Think about if those 3 favorite shows get together and decide, I need 25 cents an episode. Or, pay us $1 a month. Will you pay $1 a month to listen to your 3 favorite shows? I bet you would. And if you listen to massively popular shows, if there's 1 million people who would make that same decision that you did, that show now makes $1 million a month. So don't think that these big shows aren't going to look at different avenues of monetization. And believe me, I'm sure they'll keep charging bigger and bigger advertising rates for all the Casper mattresses, for all the servers or the furniture or the delivery services. But at some point, will you pay $1 a month? And that question is going to come your way. And I think once that happens and the big shows start to do that, we're going to be in a whole new world, because we see HBO Max, we see Disney Plus, we see Apple TV Plus. They're all inbound. They're all coming. Guess what? Peacock is coming next year. NBC's streaming service. CBS All Access is already out there. You see all the individual stations creating their own premium offerings. What makes you think the big shows aren't going to start to do that soon? Or the big networks? And
I have a warning for anybody who's thinking like, $1 a month's a lot, or I'm not going to do it. I have, for only pretty much in the past year, started to pay attention to Twitch, which for the most part, or at least it was started as a way to watch people play games, and they have commentary. Twitch was then purchased by Amazon, and now Twitch allows you to have subscriber levels where there's free content, but there's additional content. There's quote unquote the tip jar, right? And I look at the fact that I am one of the older people, engaging in Twitch, and it's a model that works for some people as income, in the same way that Patreon is for some people. And it's the thing about Twitch, which is the reason I bring it up, is I still don't quite understand all of it. Like, I've just explained to you basically how it works, but I feel like I might be missing something. But that's the next generation. That's from those numbers from Stitcher. That's that 13 to 24 demographic of people that utilize Twitch a little bit more as a source of entertainment, and they're used to that. They're used to, oh, that was cool. Here's 100 bits. I don't know what the rate is, but here's $1, whatever it is, and that's not exclusive necessarily, but it's tiered, and that's what the next generation is used to, and the rest of us have to adopt. Because,
and to be honest with you, it's an improvement, right? I mean, Jason, you're a creator. You write. You've done podcasts and all this stuff. And let's be honest. The way the world should work is that if you enjoy a creator's work, you should pay for it. I mean, straight up, that's the way, in an ideal world, that's the way it should work, right? That if you go to a movie, you don't get to see it for free. You pay for it. That would be via Netflix, a theater, or a cable subscription. Some of your costs that you pay is ultimately going to that creator, whether you listen on Spotify or Apple Music or whatever the case may be. The problem is, or not the problem, the standard has been set in a couple of mediums where, to sort of hook people, if you will, the internet being one, blogs, podcasts, that the idea was we're going to give it away for free first, get everybody hooked, and then start to figure out ways to get money out of those passionate listeners, readers, the attentive audience. And it's a difficult process, but it's one that has to happen if you want that creative juice to keep flowing. If you want more blog, if you want more books, if you want more podcasts, if you want more songs, these people don't do this. They have rent, they have mortgage, they have food, they have needs. And to keep doing this stuff, they need to start having that income from somewhere. And I think that's always so important, and always makes my blood boil when I see the people who start to get pissy about the concept of having to pay for something. Now, don't get me wrong, and I want to be very, very clear about this. I don't subscribe to Luminary, and all the podcasts I listen to up to this point, I have not, quote, paid for. However, this is what I have done. At one time, I contributed to over a dozen Patreons. I have podcast T-shirts from 8 or 10 different independent podcasters, right? And there's, not to mention the promotion and things I've done through this show and so on and so forth. I have always kept at the forefront of my mind this concept that to be able to continue to do what so many of my favorite folks do, you can't just say listen and heart emoji on Twitter. That at some point there has to be this move to actual action. And that's where I think exclusivity starts to come in. You want this, you're going to have to come here, and it might cost you.
And just as an end note on that, while in a perfect world, if you enjoy something, you should pay for it. We're not in a perfect world, but for most creators, there is probably a way where you can support them if you want to. Whether it's their Patreon, whether it's buying a T-shirt or some merch, whatever it is, if you like their content, maybe throw them a couple bucks, because maybe it's the one thing that keeps it from being exclusive. And then you can share it with your friends, and maybe they'll like it, and they'll throw them a bucks too. But those avenues are not closed because they're not asking for it right now. Most people will be ecstatic at having another Patreon supporter or selling another T-shirt. So it's there. You have to look for it. And these are I'm not talking about that show you maybe occasionally like. We're talking about the shows you love and that you listen to all the time.
Speaking to listening to all the time, there's a lot of listening going on. And what keeps happening in the podcast space, Jason, and it seems like there's a new one weekly right now, our daily podcast, which is a super interesting concept because this show is every 2 weeks. At its prime, it was weekly.
My show's every 2 weeks.
Every 2 weeks. And the idea of producing a daily podcast, don't get me wrong, it's not a new concept. It's been done before. Hell, I remember there was a show used to put them out 3 times a day. Right, there's a morning, a midday, and an evening. I cannot tell you what show that was. It was way back in the early days, and it was probably co-opted stuff off of broadcast. But I understand that it's not a completely new concept, but it's somewhat new in the way that we're seeing them now, and that is the daily podcast. It is happening. Big players are getting into this. Audiences are asking for it, and we're seeing a huge influx of them just in the last several weeks. Jason, you got the list there. What have we seen here just recently?
ESPN Daily, The Lead, Horoscope Today, Impeachment, a Daily Podcast, What a Day, and Shortwave. And that's just recently. That's not the ones that have maybe been announced, and that's not the ones that already exist.
Right.
And obviously there's some big players in that too. So, Dan, do you listen to a daily?
I do. I listen to 2 right now. I listen to New York Times, of course, the Daily. I imagine a big portion of folks listening right now listen to that show. It is, again, not the first one to do it, but I would argue it was the serial of the Daily podcast in the sense that it started to sort of prove the concept. To say that this could be wildly successful, New York Times pumped a bunch of money into it. And it was funny when the Podcast Digest was really revving on regular weekly episodes and interviews, I got this close, a little behind the scenes story here, of getting an interview with Michael Barbaro, the host of The Daily. This was a couple of months after The Daily launched, and of course I'd subscribed, and I was enjoying it. It was very informative, and it still is to this day. And the thing is, if you're not listening to The Daily right now, The Daily has attracted some of the best podcast producers and reporters that you ever wanted to see. I listened to the last episode of Startup today, and they talked about I believe Karen Chow, who was Lisa Chow, who was a host for several years at Startup, is now part of the team at The Daily. a producer, Claire Tenniscatter. She was the producer on a show called Codebreaker, who I had as a guest on the Podcast Digest several years ago. She's also a part of The Daily, and The Daily's just attracting like an all-star roster of audio production. And what they're doing right now, and you think about this thing that's being produced and released every 24 hours, I mean, from editing to sound design to storytelling to narrative, it is just exceptionally produced in the concept of a 24-hour window. Like I said, I don't probably need to tell hardly anyone listening because I imagine most of you are also subscribed. But the second one is a newer one. It was on your list just now, Jason. That was The Lead from The Atlantic. Now, The Atlantic is a premium sports publication. It's subscription-based. I do not subscribe to that at this point, although I have considered it. They've run a few specials. But they have a free daily podcast, and I've started to listen to this in the past week or so, and it is modeled very much on The Daily, and it is, basically topical, in-depth storytelling, 25 minute format, and they did, the story of the NBA and China kerfuffle here lately. They've done a story on NBA or NFL refs and why they just cannot seem to get things right nowadays, and it is in-depth storytelling, almost investigative journalism in the sports world on a daily basis. And it's excellent. It is phenomenal. And there's more coming out all the time. And I love them. Do you, Jason?
I don't. I'm not. I'm currently subscribed to one daily. I've been subscribed to that for a year. I want to say, and that's Tech Meme Ride Home. And I maybe listen to it once every couple weeks, and I just listen to the most recent one. A daily podcast is very hard for me, and I know it's just a little bit amount of time, right? But I consider a good as a podcast listener, I consider it a good week when come Thursday I've listened to all my shows, because I don't have shows on my subscription that release on Friday or Saturday. So my listening week starts on Sunday, and by Thursday evening, if I'm caught up, fantastic. Like that's a win. And I end up listening through the weekend most weekends just because life happens, work happens. So a daily, it's rough because I'd have to put it in between other things. It's just not I guess at the end of the day, I know it's great content. I'm just not that kind of listener, I guess would be my answer.
Well, it sounds like one of the things you're facing, Jason, and I have been here 10 times over, in the sense that you end up basically scheduling your max capacity for podcast listening in regular subscriptions. And as long as those shows continue to release on a regular schedule, you have little or no room for anything else. This has been the bane of my existence since the start of the Podcast Digest. And it is the most difficult thing to manage because I'm with you in the sense that I have this core group of shows that I absolutely love. I don't want to miss any of them, and I'm always listening to them day of or day after, whatever. And there is little to no headroom beyond that for anything else. I have struggled with this for years now, and there is only one solution, which is that one or two of the must-listens have to be downgraded. They've got to go down to an occasional or rarely to allow the room for something else to slide in. I know it's a terrible concept and it seems absolutely unavoidable. The only thing I would challenge you is to think of this, that if you can't get to the place where you could do something like that, then ultimately whatever your docket of shows are, whether that's 6, 8, 10, 20, whatever it is, that will be the only world you're ever exposed to. As great as they all may be, there are, 700,000 shows in iTunes right now, although 300,000 of them are active, but whatever. I guarantee you, there is at least one other show in that catalog that you're not subscribed to and you don't have a time to give a chance to, that you would love better than one of those on your must-listen-to list right now.
So I understand where we're going with this conversation. And I want to say I have what I'll call some flex room in my podcast listening. And I use that for research. I use that to make sure that I'm up to date with anybody we interview. I use that to make sure I can do some maybe background research. I mean, I have a blog and I do research for some of my posts. Those that aren't reviews where it's just my opinion. And I do use podcasts for research too, because it's always nice to hear what other people think. I don't presume to live in my own bubble, but I am an analytical person. So let's say my flex time, I'm not willing to give up. Like if I need to, I can listen to shows I didn't get to during the week. That's my flex time. But if I drop a weekly show that's 90 minutes, that's my Wednesday show, and I give it up for a daily, though, Dan. Like
the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday episodes of the daily.
I can't, that's so... I don't know. And
you listen to the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday episodes.
And then I have to give up another show for my Thursday. And I mean, let me ask you this, because you actually listen to them, and I presume you try and get to them daily. What is it like listening to a daily a day late? Like,
oh, it's okay.
Okay.
Right. And at least one of the things, and I can't speak for all of them. I mean, those ones you listed to right now, I subscribe to one of those on the list, plus New York Times A Daily, although I am going to be subscribing to Crooked Media's What a Day. This was the whole kind of crux of this big news flash, is Crooked Media announced What a Day starts next week on October 28th, a daily podcast from the people who brought you Pod Save America. I listen to, I believe right now, 4 Pod Save or Crooked Media shows. I listen to Pod Save America. I listen to Love It or Leave It. I listen to Pod Save the World, and I also subscribe to The Wilderness when it was out. So What a Day I'm probably going to subscribe to as well. So now I'm up to my 3rd daily show. Now, the way I manage dailies is that basically I sort of triage it like any other podcast. Podcast episodes, when they release, and right now I'm still subscribed to 130 shows right now. I manage them all effectively the same way, which is I look at the episode and it falls into one of 3 categories. Listen now, listen later, or skip. Right? I use Castro. I know I'm in the minority of a lot of people who use iOS in terms of Castro. A lot of people are Overcast or just Apple Podcasts, but I use Castro. But you can do this in other apps as well, which is I have one big long playlist that I constantly feed. A new episode comes in, I'm either adding it to the top or the bottom of that list, or I'm just skipping it. And that's how I do it, right? I do not listen to every episode of every show I'm subscribed to. I simply couldn't. Even if I didn't have a job, I couldn't. There's just not enough hours in a day or a week. So I triage. But I'm subscribed to the shows I know I've liked more than a couple of episodes, and I want to see what they're putting out. And if I like what they're putting out, I'm going to add it to my queue. If I don't, I'll skip it, and I'll look at next week's. Same thing with the daily. If I like this episode, if this topic for this, we talked about a couple of the topics that, the Atlantic Sports Show has. Same thing with the Daily from New York Times. They list the subject of what they're talking about. If it's something I really want to hear, if it's really something I want to dig in on and hear, breaking news, story, whatever, I'll listen to that day. If I listen to it the next day or day after, the way most of these shows are produced is it is more investigative or narrative journalism. And so even if it's a couple days old, it still has value. So one of the things, and it took me not a long time to learn this, but it took me like in hindsight to realize this. And you are a pick and choose WTF with Mark Maron listener. And I know almost everybody I know is I look at the guest and I decide if I'm listening to Maron this week. And I learned a long time ago that I learn as much, if not more, from the guests that are on Maron who I've never heard of. So for me, Maron, especially because of his
lists of people he usually gets, Marin's like, I don't skip it, which granted for me, that's technically 2 pod slots, right? Because it's twice a week. And they're full length. It's not like a daily where it's a little truncated. So it's been hard for me to kind of move away from things. But to go back to our last news episode, I can't export out of Stitcher. It's just not a thing they are capable of or are willing to do. It's not a feature they're willing to give people. I actually reached out to Stitcher and I shared the email with Dan. Like they're like, "Yep, nope, sorry, can't do it." I was like,
can we just stick a pin in that for a second, Jason, and just say?
Well, what I was going to say was, I will be shopping other pod apps, and what I was getting to was, there's going to be a reckoning on all my playlists because I'm going to have to take the time to rebuild the playlists I have, right?
Yeah.
The sometimes playlist with more shows than I know what to do with, the regular playlist, and then the dead playlist, and just in case something comes back from the dead. So there is going to be a reckoning, right? At least as far as my pod subscriptions are concerned, because I have to like your show enough to want to look for it again.
And if I can just say, to steal your term from earlier this episode, Jason, which I meant to mention back then, is actually a great podcast name, and you should probably go to Hover and reserve this and sign up for this. But Juicy Tangent, which I think is the next podcast, Juicy Tangent. Let's just pause for a second on your experience with Stitcher, and you did send me those emails, and that is mind-blowing. Ladies and gentlemen, I assure you, you can go into any podcast app that is out there and you can export an OPM file. You can import an OPM file. An OPM file is a very old technology that's been around since the dawn of the dinosaurs that simply is it's just a list of the shows you subscribe to. Don't get it twisted. Stitcher has the full ability to do this. They simply want to have lock-in. And so now Jason, still to this day, is not on a new app. Why? Because there's overhead now for him. He's going to have to screenshot all of his subscriptions or transcribe them into a spreadsheet, open a new app, redo everything. And it's going to take him, 45 minutes, an hour or more. And who's got time, right? At some point. And
it's not just that. There are shows I've slightly fallen behind on, right? So
listening progress, right?
Yep. So I'm going to either have to lose all that or have to figure it out. So obviously, let's say I settled on an app tomorrow. I'm still stuck with Stitcher for at least another 4 months just for reference.
Right. So, to be fair, I want to be clear. OPM, export or import, doesn't bring your progress anyways. It's just your subscriptions. But the point is that I'm getting at is that this is almost, to me, this is just me in my 12 years of being a podcast listener, or however long I've been, the idea that you can't export your subscriptions is almost up there with like a skip forward 30-second or a back 15-second button. It is almost considered to me to be such a basic feature, in the fact that Stitcher itself doesn't offer it. If you're on it, folks, strongly reconsider it. And if you are looking for a podcast app, this is just me, skip Stitcher. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I will probably end up making some notes. It'll probably be an ongoing report here on the Podcast Digest as I report back on. I'll probably try at least 4 or 5. I'm still not sure what try means, which is why I haven't done it yet. But I will try 4 or 5 and report back before I make a decision. Because I feel like I have the ability to test the waters. So I'm going to. And if to get it back to if this ends up trimming my subscription feed a bit, I could subscribe to it daily and give it a shot.
Might have room. Might have room for some new shows.
It's definitely possible. It's definitely possible.
Well, we're all about the news shows here at the Podcast Digest. All about it was the hardest thing for me to learn. And to be fair, I want to just be clear. What I'm referring to is only if you want to bring in the new blood, right? So if you have your subset of shows that, dear listener, you love and you're happy with, then great. I'm not telling you have to change. But if you do kind of want, if you start to hear about other things, or you listen to this show and we talk about other stuff, or you've read it, in your on Facebook or your RSS feed or something's come up, and you're like, I might want to check that out. It does have some hard decisions that you have to ultimately end up making. And what I'd say is you don't have to unsubscribe to the shows you love. Stay subscribed, just add more, and just move into a triage mode. It's hard. There's maybe only 6 shows, I think, or so that I listen to every episode every time, but none of them I listen to day and date. There is no show I listen to day of date, the date it releases every single week. It happens occasionally, but most of the time I'm listening to an episode 2, 3, 4 days later. It's fine. It's not the end of the world. You move on. Why? Because you're listening to something else great you love too. And it's tough, but you will get there.
And Dan,
you too, Jason.
One of our mutual podcasts has been on hiatus, and it's a pod slot I'm not willing to give up yet. Right? So Couple Things podcast went on break. Paternity, maternity leave, I guess, is what we'll call it. And I'm not willing to give up their slot.
I have no idea what that means, Jason. That's an hour and a half of podcast listening time that you have available every week that you should be filling with a different show.
I'm filling it with back catalogs I'm still going through. Because I'm that guy. Not for every show, but for some shows I want completionist mode.
Yeah. Well, folks, how about this? Let Jason and I know exactly what you think about these daily podcasts, what you think about Apple search and the idea of transcripts coming through, what you think about the broadening and diversifying audience of podcasts, or what you think about exclusive shows landing with particular networks or being monetized in that way. I want to hear about it. I'm sure Jason does. You can email the show, thepodcastdigest@gmail.com, or find Jason online at Agent Palmer or myself with the show at Pod Digest. There is all kinds of feedback mechanisms. Those are the best ways. Oh, in case anybody even cares or notices, if you followed the Podcast Digest on Facebook, I have finally decided to blow up and permanently delete my Facebook account because Facebook is a terrible service and literal scourge on humanity. So I've decided to get out of that game. So the Podcast Digest page for Facebook is actually going to be disappearing in mid-November. So follow us on Twitter or go to the website and bookmark it or send us an email, thepodcastdigest@gmail.com, because that Facebook is going to die soon, if it hasn't already. So
in the meantime, Dan, 2 weeks ago, No, not 2 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago. The last time we did a news, we started a new segment called The Holdover.
Yes, we did.
So, Dan, what do you have for our listeners and for myself to hold us over in the off week till the next?
I came across a new show that I found, I heard about, I saw come up, what have you, and I listened to the very first episode of this brand new show, and I could not be more excited about it. It's called Office Ladies. It is from Jen Fisher and Angela Kinsey, two of those many stars on NBC's famous show, The Office, which for now is still on Netflix and is still one of my favorite shows ever. One of the best comedies ever made for American television. And Jenna and Angela are going through a watch-along podcast. Every episode of the show, it will be a new episode of the podcast. It's a weekly podcast. They did the pilot last week. Imagine episode 1 or 2 or however they're going to number it is coming up soon. And they're going to do all of the seasons, and it's going to be amazing. I have been listening. Speaking of shows that I tuck in the background and fill in when I have a few, an opening in my playlist, West Wing Weekly. I'm a huge fan of the West Wing. I am still working through the West Wing Weekly. I know that the show's not done yet, but they're in season 7. I'm only on season 5 in my listening, but I listen to the West Wing Weekly, and it seems like Jenna and Angela have kind of taken a few cues from the West Wing Weekly in terms of their format and how they're doing things. And the first episode was amazing. It's an Earwolf show, and I have a feeling this is going to be a gangbusters. If you love The Office, you have to check out Office Ladies. Jason, what do you got to hold me over?
I fell in love with Sturgill Simpson's new album, Sound and Fury. And I fell in love with it because of the Netflix special, which is a very odd way to come up with and find and fall in love with an album. But Sturgill Simpson came out with an album called Sound and Fury, and he had it. It's basically like a bunch of animators create this. This storyline. I don't want to call it anything other than that because there is a story to it, and it's fantastic. Visually, it's stunning. Sonically, I love the album. It very much is a concept album, and it's. I heard him in an interview when I was researching a post where I reviewed said Netflix special, which will be out Thursday as you're listening to this. October 24th, I think, is Thursday. And he said it very much is a concept album, and it shouldn't have ever had a single because, you're supposed to listen to the whole piece. And you can. It's actually less than some podcasts. It's 42 minutes, whether you watch it on Netflix or just find it on Spotify or your streaming app of choice. But I can't say enough good things about it. It is such an amazing sonic experience, and I'm an old man. I mean, the Podcast Digest listeners don't know this yet, but I'm a very old man set in my ways. So a new album came out and stunned me in October 2019. That's something worthy of something. I don't know.
Something worthy of something. That's why we've got you on this show, Jason. So,
I'm
way with words.
I'm pithy.
That's it. That's definitely the case. Well, folks, that will do it for this week. We got you 2 things to hold you over. Take a look at them both. Links will be in the show notes. For episode 162 of the Podcast Digest, for Jason, I'm Dan. We will see you next time, folks.